Have you ever caught yourself staring out the window, wondering if the big adventures of life are behind you now that you've hit 70? Maybe you've thought, I'm too old for that, or that ship has sailed. Well, I'm here to tell you that ship hasn't left the dock yet. It's just waiting for you to climb aboard. Saying yes to adventure after 70 isn't just possible. It's one of the most thrilling ways to rediscover who you are and what you're capable of. I've got a story for you that'll prove it. And by the time we're done, you might just be itching to try something new yourself. Picture this: a woman named Ruth, 72 years young, who'd spent most of her life raising kids, working a steady job, and keeping the house running like clockwork. She was the kind of person who always put everyone else first. Sound familiar? But one day, after her husband passed, she found herself alone with a quiet house and a nagging feeling that there had to be more. Then, out of the blue, her grandson tossed out a crazy idea. "Grandma, let's go hike part of the Appalachian Trail together." Ruth laughed at first. Her? Hiking? She hadn't laced up a pair of boots since the 1970s, and even then, it was just to chase her kids around the yard. But something about the way he said it stuck with her. What if she said yes? Now, I know what you might be thinking. Hiking sounds like something for the young folks, right? But here's the thing. Adventure doesn't care how old you are. It's not about climbing Mount Everest or running a marathon. It's about stepping out of that cozy, familiar bubble and letting yourself feel alive again. For Ruth, that first yes was the spark. She didn't just agree to the hike. She decided to embrace the whole messy, exciting process of getting ready for it. And that's what we're going to explore together. What happens when you let that spark ignite something bigger, and how you can take your own first steps toward an adventure of your own. So, Ruth started small. She didn't wake up the next day and strap on a 50-pound backpack. No, she began with what she had: a pair of sneakers and a little determination. She'd walk around her neighborhood, just 10 minutes at first, chatting with neighbors and noticing how the fresh air cleared her head. Those walks turned into 20 minutes, then 30. And before long, she was trekking up small hills near her house. She wasn't training for the Olympics. She was training for herself, and every step made her feel a little stronger, a little braver. That's the first thing you'll notice when you say yes to something new. It doesn't have to be grand or perfect. It just has to be yours. What made Ruth's story so special wasn't the hike itself, though we'll get to that. It was how that one decision rippled into everything else. She started sleeping better. Her knees didn't ache as much, and she even found herself laughing more. Saying yes wasn't just about the trail. It was about waking up a part of her she'd forgotten was there. And that's what I want you to think about. What's one thing you've always wanted to try, but shoved to the back of your mind? Maybe it's not hiking. Maybe it's taking a painting class, learning to salsa dance, or even driving to a town you've never visited. The point is, adventure doesn't have a rule book. It's whatever makes your heart beat a little faster. Now let's fast forward a bit. Ruth and her grandson set a date for their Appalachian Trail adventure. Nothing too wild, just a 3-day trip on a beginner-friendly stretch. But getting there meant facing a few hurdles. She had to figure out what to pack, how to handle the uneven ground, and let's be honest, whether her body could keep up. She wasn't some fitness guru. She was a regular woman who'd spent decades sitting more than moving. So she got practical. She borrowed a lightweight backpack from her grandson, bought a sturdy pair of walking sticks from the local sporting goods store, and practiced carrying a little weight on her walks. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And that's the beauty of it. You don't need fancy gear or a personal trainer. You just need to start with what's in front of you. As the trip got closer, Ruth noticed something else. She wasn't just preparing her body. She was preparing her mind. She'd catch herself smiling at the thought of sitting by a campfire or seeing the sunrise from a trail overlook. That anticipation, that little buzz of excitement, was something she hadn't felt in years. And here's where it gets real. Saying yes doesn't mean you won't be nervous. Ruth was terrified she'd slow her grandson down or trip over a rock and embarrass herself. But she decided those fears weren't going to write the end of her story. She was going to write it herself, one step at a time. So, they hit the trail. Ruth, her grandson, and a backpack that felt heavier than she'd expected. The first day was tough. Her legs burned, the path was steeper than she'd imagined, and she had to stop more than she wanted to. But then something magical happened. She looked up from her tired feet and saw it. A view of rolling hills stretching out like a painting. The kind of beauty that makes you forget the ache in your knees. Her grandson grinned and said, "See, Grandma? Told you you could do it." And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just surviving the trail. She was living it. That's what saying yes does. It takes you places you never thought you'd go, inside and out. Ruth's story isn't over yet, and neither is ours. That first day on the trail was just the beginning of what she discovered about herself, and what you might discover too. Because here's the thing, adventure isn't a one-time deal. It's a door that keeps opening wider the more you walk through it. So let's keep going. There's more to unpack about how Ruth's trip changed her and how you can take that same leap no matter where you're starting from. So there Ruth was, standing on that trail with her grandson, soaking in a view that made every sore muscle worth it. She could have called it quits right then, chalked it up as a nice memory, and gone home to her recliner. But something had shifted. That first day wasn't the end of her adventure. It was the moment she realized she wasn't done yet. Saying yes had unlocked a kind of energy she didn't know she still had, and she wasn't about to let it fizzle out. The next couple of days on the Appalachian Trail showed her, and they'll show you too, that adventure after 70 isn't just about the big moments. It's about what happens in between. The second day started early, with mist still hanging over the trees and the sound of birds waking up all around. Ruth's legs were stiff, and she'll tell you she wasn't exactly bounding out of her sleeping bag like a 20-year-old. But she got up anyway. She and her grandson made coffee over a little camp stove. Nothing fancy, just instant packets, and sat there sipping it while the sun peeked over the ridge. It was quiet, simple, and perfect. She said later that it was one of the best mornings of her life, not because it was flashy, but because she was there, really there, living it. That's something adventure gives you. A chance to slow down and notice the little things you might have missed back in the rush of everyday life. Now, don't get me wrong, Ruth wasn't turning into some wilderness expert overnight. The trail had its challenges. She tripped once on a root and nearly twisted her ankle. And there was a stretch where the bugs were so bad, she swore they were holding a convention just for her. But here's what she figured out. Those hiccups didn't ruin the trip. They made it hers. Every time she stumbled and caught herself with those walking sticks, or swatted a mosquito and kept going, she felt tougher, not in some superhero way, but in a real, human way. And that's what I want you to hear. Saying yes doesn't mean everything's smooth sailing. It means you're willing to roll with the bumps and come out smiling. By the time they hit the third day, Ruth was in a rhythm. Her grandson would scout ahead a bit, then circle back to check on her. But she didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a partner. They'd stop for water breaks, munching on trail mix. She'd packed extra raisins because she's always loved them, and swapped stories about his college classes and her old camping trips with her husband decades ago. It hit her then. This wasn't just about proving she could hike a trail. It was about connecting, about building something new with someone she loved. Adventure has a way of doing that. It pulls you closer to the people you share it with, even if it's just a neighbor you convince to try a pottery class with you. And let's talk. talk about what Ruth's body was telling her by now. She was tired, sure. 3 days of walking isn't a stroll around the block, but she was also surprised. Her knees, which used to creak like an old door every morning, felt looser. Her back didn't hurt as much as she'd expected. She wasn't ready to run a race, but she wasn't falling apart either. Turns out, moving a little more than usual didn't break her. It woke her up. That's the secret nobody tells you. Your body might not be 30 anymore, but it's still got some fight left if you give it a chance. Ruth wasn't thinking about that in some scientific way. She just knew she felt better than she had in years. When they finished the hike, dusty and grinning, Ruth didn't feel like she'd conquered the world. She felt like she'd rediscovered it. Her grandson snapped a photo of her at the trailhead, holding up one of those walking sticks like a victory flag, and she keeps that picture on her fridge now. But the real win wasn't the hike itself. It was what came after. Back home, she didn't slip right back into her old routine. She started looking for the next thing. Not another trail. Not yet. But little sparks of adventure she could say yes to. She signed up for a local gardening club, something she'd always wanted to try, but never made time for. She even talked her grandson into taking a weekend road trip to a nearby lake later that summer. That's the thing about saying yes. It doesn't stop with one big moment. It's like dropping a pebble in a pond. The ripples keep going. Ruth found herself chatting with new people at the gardening club, swapping tips about growing tomatoes, and laughing over how she'd accidentally planted zucchini upside down. She'd come home with dirt under her nails and a lightness in her step she hadn't felt since her kids were little. And that road trip? It wasn't some grand expedition, just a couple of days fishing and eating sandwiches by the water. But it was hers, and it mattered. So where does that leave us? Ruth's story shows that adventure after 70 isn't about being fearless or having endless energy. It's about starting where you are, with what you've got, and letting it grow. Maybe you're not ready to hike a trail, and that's okay. But what about a walk in a park you've never been to? Or pulling that dusty guitar out of the closet and strumming a few chords? The point is, there's a spark waiting for you too. It's just a matter of saying yes and seeing where it takes you. Ruth's journey didn't end at the trailhead, and yours doesn't have to end where you're sitting right now either. Let's keep exploring what that could look like, because there's more to this than just one trip. So, Ruth came home from that hike with a photo on her fridge and a new kind of fire in her belly. She'd tasted what it felt like to step out of her comfort zone, and it wasn't something she could unfeel. That's the funny thing about adventure. It sticks with you, like a song you can't stop humming. She wasn't about to let it fade into a remember when story she'd tell over coffee. No, she wanted more. And not because she suddenly had boundless energy or a bucket list a mile long. It was simpler than that. She'd remembered how good it felt to be curious, to try something and see what happened. And that's where her story, and maybe yours, starts to take root. Back in her everyday life, Ruth kept the momentum going. But she didn't overcomplicate it. That gardening club she joined, it wasn't just about planting seeds in the ground. It was about planting seeds in herself. She'd show up with her little trowel, knees creaking as she knelt down, and spend an hour or two with folks who got just as excited about a blooming marigold as she did. She'd never been much of a gardener before, but there she was, learning how to prune roses and laughing when she got tangled in a hose. It wasn't the Appalachian Trail, but it was an adventure all the same. New faces, new skills, and a reason to get out of the house. That's the trick. Adventure doesn't always mean packing a bag and heading into the wild. Sometimes it's right there in your own backyard, waiting for you to notice. And then there was that road trip with her grandson to the lake. Nothing fancy, just a couple of fishing poles, a cooler with sandwiches, and a beat-up old car that smelled faintly of her husband's pipe tobacco from years ago. They drove with the windows down, singing along to songs on the radio she hadn't heard since the 60s. When they got there, she didn't catch a single fish. Turns out she's better at scaring them away with her chatter. But she didn't care. They sat on a rickety dock, feet dangling over the water, and talked about everything and nothing. She told him stories about her first job at a diner, and he told her about some girl he liked at school. It was easy, messy, and real. Saying yes to that trip didn't just give her a weekend away, it gave her a memory she'll carry forever. Now, let's get practical for a minute, because I know you might be wondering how this fits into your own life. Ruth didn't have some secret formula. She just started small and kept it simple. That's the key. You don't need to overhaul everything or have all the answers up front. Maybe you're thinking about something like a dance class, but worried your hips won't cooperate. Fair enough. Start with a YouTube video in your living room, swaying to a song you love, and see how it feels. Or maybe you've always wanted to visit a museum but haven't gone because it's an hour away. Grab a friend, split the gas, and make a morning of it. The first step doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to happen. Ruth learned that too. After the lake trip, she didn't rush into anything wild. She took her time, listening to what felt right. One day, she decided to try cooking something she'd never made before. Homemade bread. She'd always relied on the store-bought stuff, but there was something about kneading dough that called to her. The first loaf came out lumpy and a little burnt, but she ate it anyway, slathered with butter and grinned like she'd won a prize. It wasn't about the bread being flawless. It was about the doing. That's what adventure after 70 boils down to. Giving yourself permission to try, to mess up, to laugh about it, and to try again. And here's the best part. Every time Ruth said yes to something, whether it was hiking, gardening, or burning bread, she got braver. Not in some loud, showy way, but quietly, inside. She started trusting herself more, believing she could handle whatever came next. That's what happens when you step out. It's not just about the thing you're doing. It's about who you become while you're doing it. Ruth wasn't the same woman who'd hesitated over her grandson's hiking idea. She was someone who knew she could surprise herself. And that's a gift you can give yourself too, no matter how many candles were on your last birthday cake. So, where does that leave you? Ruth's story isn't about her being special. It's about her being willing. Willing to start, willing to stumble, willing to keep going. You don't need to hike a trail or knead dough to feel that. Maybe it's calling up an old friend you've lost touch with, or signing up for that watercolor class at the community center. Whatever it is, it's yours to claim. And when you do, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me what you're saying yes to. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be yours. If you've enjoyed Ruth's journey and want more stories like this, practical, real, and full of heart, give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. There's so much more we can explore together because age isn't the end of the road. It's just a new mile marker. Here's to saying yes, to stepping out, and to living your best life, one adventure at a time. See you soon.